Hi, I'm Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I'm here with a January wrap up. I think we'll just say goodbye to December. That's gone now. We won't really ever catch up. I've forgotten what I read in December. I know that I had quite a good reading month in amongst it all, but we just have to let that go. So we're catching up with January or even a combined wrap up, because I think this one might have even been December. This is Leonardo Da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. And so late last year I was in the mood for non-fiction, and I was reading off my shelf because I have a lot of non-fiction that I've have not got to, and still a lot to go. But this one, obviously being so chunky, it had never been the right time to pick it up. I never felt like I had time to read it, and I just decided I'm not in the mood for any of my novels that I've got there, so I'll pick this one up. And I'm really glad I read it. It is like Walter Isaacson's other work. I think I've read the Steve Jobs biography that he wrote, and there's another one that's well known, but it's very comprehensive, so that's why it is so long. And he does have an engaging writing style, so it doesn't feel heavy to read. He's got a very lucid style, and yeah, he writes well, but it is just every single aspect, so you get the full picture. And of course in doing that you lose a little bit of energy in the sense of just being told a really interesting story, because you're getting all the bits of his life. So obviously a fascinating life, and a few things that I learnt from it was, one, that he kept a notebook and he just wrote down all of his ideas, and he had really tiny writing because I think at one stage paper was hard to get or hard to afford. But in any event, that was in terms of how do geniuses operate, it was interesting to think he really kept notes all the time. Any ideas he would note down, and of course his brain was so all-encompassing that it might be an idea for a painting or a sculpture on the same page as an idea for how to make a flying machine, or some architectural work that he was thinking of, or a mathematical equation. And so you can imagine these notebooks, which I think Walter Isaacson has viewed, would be amazing to see them. You can, because some of them have been kept, and so you can go and see them. It did make me want to go to Florence, because there's a lot of Florence and Milan were two cities that he focuses on a lot in terms of where Leonardo da Vinci lived at different points, and just the flourishing arts scene that was in those cities in the 1500s. And it also reminded me of the importance of those big sort of wealthy families who were the patrons for the artists, and how that made possible some of those great works of art that we know today. But also, on the other hand, Leonardo da Vinci hardly ever finished anything. He was such a perfectionist that a lot of his work he just kept going back to again and again and again before he would be satisfied. And indeed, often he was never satisfied that it was finished. And I just wondered, how would he go today in a commercial context? How would he make a living? Because at some point you have to put your work out into the world and earn some money from it, I suppose. But so really interesting, a true genius, and Walter Isaacson has really covered every facet. And there's also some new material that's come out that's slowly being unearthed over recent years, and some paintings that they've been able to analyse and so on. So there's it's very up to date in terms of the information. So I recommend it, and it will make you want to go to Italy. Probably if you know a little bit about art or about art history, you'll get even more out of it, because I'm coming to it fairly like a blank slate. So there was a lot to take in, but that was good to read. Leonardo da Vinci. Going back to fiction, and I can't remember what order I did these, but I had bought ages ago Greenwood by Michael Christie. I think Sarah at South Seas Books said that it was quite popular, and a friend of mine had really enjoyed it, and I think they did it for their book club, and she said it was a really good read. And so even though it didn't appeal to me, and I didn't like the cover, and it reminded me a little bit of the Oh, my brain, the Over story, which I loved, but I don't feel like I need to read another similar book. I still thought I have to give it a go because it had been recommended. As it happened, I didn't really love it. It is a sort of near future setting, so 2038. On a remote island in Canada, and the setup is that that's one of the last places you can sort of be outside, one of the world's last forests, and so wealthy tourists come from all over the world to be near the trees because there's nowhere else in the world to see a forest. So it's that dystopic, but could happen. But I didn't like it because it, two reasons. One, I felt a little bit as if I was being preached to, in the sense of it was hammering home the message that, we need to preserve the environment, we need to stop climate change, we need to look after the trees because otherwise this will happen. And I completely buy that as a message, but I don't love it in novels when it's, I found it a little bit heavy-handed as far as a novel goes. And then the other thing was that the style was quite fulsome. So you get Jake, who works at the hotel, and then you get a lot of backstory, and I just got the sense that, and again, it is really long, and I had the sense that the reason it's that long is because we're going to hear every single detail about Jake's life and all the characters' lives and what happens to them, and there just wasn't that lightness that I like. In contrast, for example, The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, which also features a hotel in Canada where tourists come because they want to be near the wilderness, and the main character works behind the bar, and you only get fragments. And in fact, Andy and I thought that was almost too fragmented, but it just was a lot lighter, and I liked that style of just cutting into the essential scene and then moving on. Whereas this, I felt like we're going the whole way, slowly and steadily, and at the stage that I picked it up, I just had no patience for that. I don't like dystopia, so I think it's just not for me, but I think it's possibly a really beautifully crafted novel with a serious message, and probably once you get more into it, you fall in love with the characters, and I think it would have all of those things if you can get past the dystopia, but it wasn't for me at that time, so I'm leaving that one. That's Greenwood by Michael Christie. That's a DNF. I also read Luster by Raven Leilani, and this was completely because of the hype. I think I heard about it on the High Low podcast with Dolly Alderton and Pandora Sykes, and then someone else had mentioned it. The cover is beautiful, and after a couple of other recommendations, I thought I have to see what all the fuss is about. It's been very buzzy, and it is a really strong book. I recommended it to our book club in Adelaide, and the girls didn't love it, I have to say, but it was quite good for discussion. And it is a debut novel, so it's not obviously going to be perfect. It was messy, but I quite liked that it was messy. I thought it was very real. It's about a young woman in her 20s who gets involved with an older man, and he says he has an open marriage, and she ends up living with him and his wife and their daughter, who's black. She's also black, and they ask her to help look after their daughter, but the couple is white, and so it brings up lots of issues of white privilege and racism, everyday racism, not in a clunky way. It just comes up as things happen, and it was a very fresh, natural, contemporary style, which I liked. So I think if you like Sally Rooney, for example, you would enjoy this because it's got that sense of youth and energy, and you do get a feeling that this is, if you're in your 20s in New York and you don't have a lot of money, on a low income, it is tough to survive, and you get a real sense of that, and it felt very authentic and very real. The plot points I didn't love. I didn't get that she really moved in. That seemed a bit contrived, that she would suddenly start living with them. I didn't ever feel any sense of attraction to this older man, or whether she did, and I don't know if she did. It might have been the point of it was that it was just transactional, or that was just something she had no expectation of having a really satisfying relationship. I don't know. I think that's why it's good for discussion. But so various points I thought didn't really work for me, but I think the voice is really strong and it did keep me engaged and it was compelling. So mixed feelings about that one. I'd love to know if you've read it, what you thought. So that was Luster by Raven Leilani, and I can't remember what order I did these, but then Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. So Meg Mason is an Australian and UK author. I think she's lived in London and Oxford for a long time, but she's also been based in Sydney. I'd heard about this on the Chat 10 Looks 3 podcast. Annabelle Crabb was raving about it, and Annie, my co-host on Books on the Go, also raved about it late last year. So I thought I'll pick it up, and I absolutely devoured this. It was a very, very compulsive read. It's been compared to Fleabag, and I think that's a good comparison. So the protagonist is Martha. She suffers from a mental illness. She's married to Patrick, but they are separating at the beginning of the novel. So then you go back and find out the backstory and how that has come to be. And she's unbearable. So I was so annoyed with her the whole time I was reading it. My sister was there, we were down at the beach house, and I kept saying, oh, she's so annoying, but also you have to read it. And that was how I felt for pretty much the whole book. It was really interesting. Annie had texted me and said, I finished Sorrow and Bliss and I have thoughts. We should do it for the podcast. So that's what spurred me on to read it. And after I finished, I was exactly the same. I said to Annie, so many thoughts, we have to talk about it. And actually, when we did the episode, it was one of the few episodes we did that we discussed spoilers, because we just had to talk about everything that happened, including at the end. And so that, I think, is a sign of a book that has that's strong and has really got you thinking. But by the end, I didn't love it, and it was partly the way she treats mental illness, and I'm really curious to know readers who have suffered with their mental health, how they read this book, because I haven't. So I'm just wondering how that reads if you've been in a similar position to Martha. And I can't say any more without spoilers. And the other thing that annoyed me was that she's so unbearable. She's a privileged white woman, and there's just this sense of her, there seems to be a lack of self-awareness about, yes, she suffers with her mental health, but there are people who have a lot more to deal with and also don't have the resources she has to get help, for example. So, and she's also got a very understanding husband, and she seems to have no gratitude at all for that, or no understanding of how lucky she is in many ways. And by the end, I sort of think, well, maybe that will be redeemed by the end. And for me, it wasn't. So I'm curious to know if you've read it, what you thought. But it didn't redeem itself by the end for me. But on the other hand, it was very witty. It made me laugh out loud. The relationship between her and her sister was really painfully funny and rang true, and that was where I got the Fleabag vibes, and it was fresh. It felt very on point. The observations are sharp. Everything about it. There's a lot to love about this book. So I think it's a cut above many books that would be in a similar vein. Annie compared it to Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine, and I can see that, but that gave me empathy for the character of Eleanor Oliphant and opened up my eyes to someone who normally is invisible, or we don't pay attention to, or we don't realise what they're struggling with. Whereas this, I just didn't feel sorry for Martha because she was so unlikable. So they're different books, obviously, but it's interesting to compare them. Sharp, a great read, but problematic for me. So again, lots to talk about. Let me know if you've read it. That's Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. I think it comes out in the UK in June, but it's out now in Australia. Then I read, this was actually my first novel. I must have read this first because I think this was my first novel of 2021, Memorial by Bryan Washington, and we did this on the podcast as well. So I wanted to read him when I heard about Lot, his short story collection 2 years ago that won the Dylan Thomas Prize. for literature. I could be wrong, but he's a young black author who is based in Houston. This is his first novel. It's about Benson and Mike, who live in Houston, but then Mike has to go to Osaka because his father's very unwell, but Mike's mother comes to Houston to stay with them at the same time. So it ends up as an odd couple story with Benson living with Mike's mother, who's a really great character, and it just explores where their relationship is at between Benson and Mike. They've been together for 4 years, and they're just a bit unsure. And again, it feels very fresh. It feels they're in their 20s. It has that contemporary, sort of a no-fuss style, and someone described him, I think it was in The Guardian, the reviewer described Bryan Washington as a very chill writer, and I loved that description because it is like that. It's a relaxing book to read in many ways because of the style, not because of the content of it. But in that same way, I like some of Haruki Murakami's work where you just relax into it. There's something calming about the style and the way the character just moves from place to place and cooks a beautiful meal in their apartment or does this or does that, and there's sort of this matter-of-fact style but without being pedestrian, and I don't know how they do it, but Bryan Washington seems to manage that as well. And I just absolutely loved this. I fell in love with the characters. I loved how he flipped the story and told us Benson's story and then Mike's story. And yeah, it was a great read. So a great start to the year in terms of fiction. So that was Memorial. And then I read The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. And we did this as well on the podcast. So we just did that last week, I think it was. And just shamelessly jumping on the bandwagon because this has been everywhere. And Annie actually said that she, in the book buying group that she's part of with her bookshop, Mostly Books, this is the first year they've done this, but they're choosing a book to feature and to give it a beautiful cover and prominence in the bookstore and things like that. So this is the book that they've chosen for this year or for this season, which explains a little bit why we've heard so much about it. And also Simon Savage raved about it and someone else has been raving about it. So I just had to find out what the fuss is about, and very different to some of the other books I've been talking about. This is more of a serious book. It's more important and it has more of a mythical quality. So the style is different. It's more ambitious and epic, I suppose, in the way he tells it, in the voice that he uses. And there's a lot of biblical references. And I think Robert Jones Jr.'s background has been religious. He might have had a Seventh-day Adventist parent and maybe a Muslim parent. I could be completely wrong, but I think he's been raised with religion and with the Bible, and that's infused into this novel. The characters have biblical names. It's set on a cotton plantation in Mississippi, and the two main characters are slaves. They are Samuel and Isaiah, who are lovers. So there is sort of a forbidden love story, but he wanted to show a happy gay love story in the time of slavery and not just a trauma narrative, and that's beautifully done. He then gives you all the perspectives, so each chapter is a new character, and so that does slow down the story a bit. And one of the reviews said, which described it as virtuosic or as a brilliant book and wonderful in every way, but did say the same thing, that they're changing each chapter and going into the head of a new character does slow down the story. And for me, it was quite a slow read. I can't say that I loved it, but maybe I did have very high expectations. However, it's a really important book because it gives you that different perspective. It gets you do feel like you're there. There's that real sense of place, and it makes you think about the suffering of these slaves and just puts you into their heads and their bodies and gives you there's a lot of humanity and a lot of compassion in the story. And again, it's just got a different take on it, a different angle. and it's beautifully written. The writing is really poetic. I thought maybe almost too much, which is not a bad criticism, and it's a debut novel, but it was so styled, and so every sentence was so beautiful and poetic that it almost not took me out of the story, but slowed down my reading of the story. And sometimes I like it when writing is just, you don't notice it so much. It doesn't have to be that you stop and go, wow, that was a beautiful poetic sentence, every single time. So I found that almost a bit too much, but that's a good criticism to make, I think. So that's The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. And that's it from me. I'd love to know what you've been reading, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.